Hi, I'm Craig Smith, a former New York Times correspondent and host of the podcast Eye on AI. I'm also a special government employee at the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, and in this role, I'm serving as the host for NSC-AI's podcast series on the Commission's work. This is the fourth of 6 episodes looking at the Commission's third quarter recommendations to Congress. This week, I talked to NSC-AI Commissioner Eric Horvitz about ensuring interoperability of AI systems with U.S. allies and working to make all AI systems reliable. I hope you find the conversation as fascinating as I did. Eric, most people know who you are, but if you could give a brief introduction, and then we'll talk about this quarter's recommendations.
I'm Eric Horvitz. I'm a commissioner on the National Security Commission on AI. I chair the effort on the ethical and responsible development and fielding of AI technologies. I'm also quite active on other lines of effort, including our focus and deliberation about AI research and development. My other hat is Chief Scientific Officer at Microsoft Corporation, as well as chairing our internal work, which is called the Ether Committee at Microsoft on AI ethics and effects in engineering and research, which has been a really interesting industrial setting for me to think through these issues with colleagues.
Last quarter, the Commission endorsed 32 recommended practices for the responsible development and fielding of AI. In its latest report, the Commission recommends that these same key considerations guide NATO in its adoption of AI. In this recommendation, you emphasize 3 areas that the Departments of State and Defense should pursue in their dialogues with NATO: achieving common documentation requirements, establishing confidence in systems of systems, and ensuring robustness and reliability. Why do you feel that the U.S. government should focus on helping NATO reach consensus to operationalize responsible AI practices in these areas?
Well, Craig, it may be best to take a step back on the efforts of our line of effort on ethics and responsible AI on the Commission. In quarter 2, we rolled out a set of key considerations that take high-level principles like those announced by the DoD earlier in the year down to a level of detail that heads into the realities of implementation. The set of 5 key considerations, the 32 recommended practices you mentioned, are grouped into the categories of values, engineering, performance, human AI interaction, and the last one on accountability and governance. As we said in quarter 2, we believe that these considerations, practices that are contained within them, are essential areas for the health and vitality of AI systems broadly in the open world. And for the Commission's work, one focus has been on providing guidance around the development and fielding of AI technologies across the family of national security-centric organizations of the U.S. But the Commission also considers the health and vitality of the U.S. more broadly, including our leadership in science, our economy, our overall well-being as a nation, and how we can leverage AI technologies in a responsible manner to best harness what we see as being at an inflection point in the applicability and power of AI systems. So our efforts provide guidance on the development and fielding of AI systems in industry, academia, and civil society. But the work is also relevant to other nations, including the nations we're close with, our allies, including NATO, the Five Eyes nations. They're also relevant to competitors. And it's especially in our interest to communicate best practices and recommendations where sharing practices is in the interest of our national security as well as other nations. Coordinating and sharing what we know about the adoption of AI will help make the world safer. Now, back to your question on our focus in quarter 3. We took a look at how our Department of Defense agencies and the Department of State might best coordinate and communicate with NATO, particularly where we can start working with the NATO countries right away. And we identified, drawn from the 32 recommendations, high priority recommendations where we see low-hanging and important fruit for getting on the same page. These recommendations are on achieving common documentation requirements, on establishing more sophistication and approaches and confidence in systems of systems and working on challenges of robustness and reliability. We see each of these recommendation areas as being important at allowing NATO members to not only have interoperable systems with one another in Europe as well as with the United States, but also have a shared level of trust and confidence that the systems they're depending on are safe, reliable, and perform as intended. We think that developing and employing common documentation requirements for the US and for NATO members will be very important in terms of the fitness and interoperability of our systems. We also want to make sure that the systems comply with the various national requirements and constraints. On the systems of systems idea, AI systems typically are composed of multiple subsystems. And then we have multiple named AI systems that might be used by the same organization. And there's an assumption these systems will work well together and coordinate. In the scientific areas of AI research, one of the most complex and challenging areas is multi-agent technologies and reasoning, figuring out how individual components or agents work together. And in some ways, the same kind of complexity shows up in bringing multiple systems together. It's a really hard and complex area. It's hard enough getting our own systems to work well together. We're calling out that systems of systems is going to be critical when it comes to coordinating among nations. And so we're recommending that as the US increases its use of AI-centric, AI-intensive systems, we need to think through US and broader NATO coordination, the important topic of systems of systems. And this includes multi-agent systems that are being explored, such as fleets and teams of autonomous or semi-autonomous systems. On the third area, ensuring robustness and reliability, this is really a challenging and such a critically important area, developing more robust AI methods that can be less brittle, that can be more generally applicable, that don't hinge on being in an exact environment they were trained for, given how complex the open world can be. We also want systems to be less vulnerable to adversarial attacks. We want to have our systems withstand or to degrade gracefully when they're targeted. We talked in quarter two about the various kinds of adversarial machine learning attacks that we need to defend against. For instance, attacks that can reveal data from a system, probe a model, confuse the AI system, or make it do the wrong thing through essentially applying the same techniques in different ways that are used to train the models to begin with.
Can I ask a couple of questions on those three to unpack them a little bit? On the common documentation requirements, certainly NATO and the NATO partners or allies have been operating with different software systems that require common documentation. So is there already a protocol or some standard in place for documentation of software systems that NATO and the US can build on? Aren't there already common documentation requirements for software between the NATO allies?
NATO countries have a rich history of sharing at multiple levels, including in system interoperability, documentation, training, the understanding of the capabilities and appropriateness of different systems, communications. In the realm of AI, we're still in the early days of coming up with common documentation and requirements, metrics for performance. This is true throughout the world. It's really great to think through what we've done in the past among the nations when it comes to coordination and shared documentation, and to build on that and to contribute to the early days of developing common documentation requirements for AI systems.
And on the systems of systems, just so I understand what you're talking about, on the multi-agent systems, you've got a system that is coordinating the agents, but then there would be an overarching command and control system that's coordinating the multi-agent group with other assets in the battlefield, for example, or that's coordinating logistics, the supply chain, and that sort of thing. Is that what you mean by systems of systems?
Let me step back a bit to unpack a couple of concepts. In the broadest sense, When we refer in this document to systems of systems, we're talking about having one system that might be, let's say, doing surveillance, another system for interpreting incoming sensor findings, a third system helping with communication. These might be separate systems, each leveraging AI in their own ways. We don't have a great understanding yet of ways to ensure good behavior when you bring multiple AI systems together. And it's not necessarily the case that when systems are built and fielded independently, even within the same agency, that there's a rich practice of worrying about the complexity of interactions of these systems, of the form that can arise with AI technologies. So in the broadest sense, the idea of thinking through details of potentially unexpected and complex interactions that can arise between multiple independently developed systems. And this, of course, also applies to AI components and technologies being used across nations. Another area is explicit multi-agent systems that are coordinating, where you have multiple agents independently making decisions, coordinating and communicating with other agents. Ideas that come to mind include swarms of drones, for example. There's been concerns about these kinds of technologies, both their power, the potential ethical issues in their use, but also in the technical details of how they work as systems of systems. Multi-agent AI is one of the more complex areas of AI research and development. And if we imagine someday that we have multiple agents working together across nations, we have the complexity of tightly coordinating systems of multiple agents. But all these areas that I just pointed out, from large-scale independently developed systems working together within an agency in peacetime or wartime, or this idea of swarms and multiple agents, they all raise issues of systems we have to work out, especially when it comes to coordination among countries.
The Commission has recommended that the U.S. government promote international standards in areas that further the responsible use of AI among the U.S. and its allies. For example, the third quarter recommendations called for technical standards in areas like privacy-preserving technology and documentation for data, models, and systems. Why focus on these areas? Can you explain why these are important areas to prioritize and get right as the international AI standards are developed?
I think it's important that the United States and its national security agencies that we're addressing take a leadership role in contributing to and thinking through evolving technical standards across multiple areas of the life cycle of developing and fielding and maintaining AI systems. We're still in the early days of these kinds of standards for discussions within different organizations, within industry and academia. Technical standards allow for collaboration and innovation. They can catalyze trust, quality assurance, help with performance evaluation. They can also protect our values, economic prosperity. I think there's an interesting finding that organizations that have helped to build and align with international standards typically have first mover advantages for coordination and competitiveness. We think that multiple practices that we pointed out in the key considerations we introduced in last quarter, the 5 key considerations, really depend and are catalyzed by getting on the same page with language and definitions and technical standardizations. In the quarter 3 report, we identified what we consider must-haves when it comes to the responsible development and fielding of AI. These include making investments in safety and reliability. Another is really thinking deeply about data, and this includes documentation and addressing legal issues, for example, with data provenance and privacy. What's the source of the data? How can it be used? Might we apply privacy-preserving machine learning technologies, learning from encrypted data, other kinds of privacy-enhancing technologies when it comes to the fuel of AI systems, data and data sets? Among countries that share our values, we have laws about privacy. that reflect our core values. And we want to make sure that we have documentation that is in line with addressing questions and requirements in different countries about the privacy of data, especially when we might work to share data across countries and agencies. Do we have the rights to share data? Do we understand in terms of the values of fairness, inclusiveness, that these data sets really are aligning with core values? There's notions of having audit trails on data that would help with this, especially data used in high stakes safety critical applications.
On the audit trails on data, that's interesting. How would that work?
Well, when we talk about data provenance, we talk about maintaining a rich record of how data was collected and from whom, and also requirements about how data can be used appropriately versus ways that it cannot be used or shared. There's been work coming out of the research community, including researchers at Microsoft Research, my home base, on a notion of data sheets for data sets, the idea of rich documentation of the nature, the sampling policies, the provenance, the accuracy, reliability, precision with which data was collected. And having data sheets always travel along as core documentation on data sets. So when the data is passed on appropriately to another use case or to another organization, that organization or the usage in a new scenario can be evaluated. Is this appropriate? Do we understand enough about this data? Is it legal to use this data? Is it ethical to use this data in the new application? The same is true for standards and documentation on models. You build a predictive model, for example, or a model used in recognition in an AI system from the data. We want to characterize how that model was built, what its characteristics are, how it was tested, what's its performance, and have that documentation travel with the model. In many ways, we like looking at the overall end-to-end documentation and standards for documenting multiple phases or components in which we build and field and maintain AI systems. This will be really critical moving forward for understanding, for example, when a system lands in an agency or over the years, we look at it being used again and again, maybe in a new setting, understanding the intention, the performance, when it was last tested, what its maintenance requirements are moving forward, how it can be used or shouldn't be used in a new environment, let's say different lighting conditions even.
Something I've wondered about is there a way to, in effect, watermark data or models so that even if the documentation doesn't follow the data or the model, you can identify its provenance and in a way that can't be altered? You can imagine there being a system that attacks the US, and if you could get a hold of a piece of hardware that has some of the code in it, is there a way to identify the provenance?
Various encryption techniques for making data available and for controlling its availability, as well as for ensuring that the documentation flows with the data, will be important. And we'll see the development of these kinds of technologies. There's been interesting work in computer science on the idea of code or data sets that carry along with it various information that's deeply embedded in the artifact.
Beyond your recommendations to collaborate with NATO and other allies, what opportunities does the Commission see to work with potential competitors? Are you worried that focusing on democratic partnerships might exclude other important players?
In the Q3 report, we focused explicitly and in coordination with another line of effort on what the U.S. Department of Defense and the U.S. Department of State could do right away, start working on with NATO countries. When thinking about the key considerations, my sense is that these considerations and practices, as I said earlier, are important to multiple organizations and states across the world. They're important areas that should be addressed, even if the first area on values differs remarkably among countries. And we've been focusing in Q3 on NATO countries that have deeply shared values, which was our key consideration number one in the Q2 report. But we've noted in our key considerations document that there are areas for international cooperation, including dialogue between the United States and strategic competitors to establish common standards and goals of AI safety and reliability, both in testing, in thinking through systems, issues around privacy, data and data uses. There's really a common interest in ensuring and assuring that our systems work as we intend them, no matter who the we is. Safety and stability are critical considerations, especially as we grow over time into situations where we have AI systems facing or interacting with AI systems across international borders. No one wants unintended escalations coming because of unexpected machine interactions as a result of how our systems act, react, or interact, especially if they're working in regimes that are poorly understood. So we discussed the importance of making sure that our own systems perform as they're intended, including as they interact with the systems in allied nations. But we also want to make sure that our systems interact with competitors in a way that avoids unintended outcomes, as should potential strategic competitors need to wish themselves and will want and desire. So exploring areas where we should cooperate with competitors is a topic we'll be looking at and taking on in more detail in our final report. And this includes looking at cooperation on safety. We think that competition should be a safe one and that systems on all sides should do what they're intended to do.
Is there talk of some international body that would oversee that kind of talk? Are you talking about bilateral cooperation with specific countries?
Yeah, my sense is there's nothing like that yet. But I'm talking about, first and foremost, this idea of making available the Commission's work broadly as being of value and being helpful to multiple nations as they think through their individual strategies, and also guiding bilateral communications and coordination.
Which areas of responsible AI do you think are ripe and musts for joint R&D across borders? And for those areas that you identify, why those in particular?
Well, multiple areas in research and development are ripe. In our key considerations document, where we rolled out 5 important areas in Q2, we stressed that international collaboration and cooperation will be necessary for testing and verifying AI system reliability and performance, including performance along shared values and goals such as fairness and privacy. We also see R&D needed and ripe in the realm of testing and performance, common standards for talking about performance. R&D is also needed in the area of privacy, how we assure the privacy of individuals is protected as data is acquired and used for AI system development. And certainly in this area of security robustness and making sure that systems are not easy to attack and brittle when it comes to adversarial efforts to confuse them or to undermine them or to extract data from them. I also see a really interesting area of work that we can share on this whole area of human AI interaction, human machine teaming, the ability of machines to explain themselves to humans, how people do under time pressure in high stakes situations when advised by AI systems, the best way to display information. This is going to be important both at the core of understandings, but also in systems that are shared across borders, where we think about joint training standards of how systems operate and can be expected to operate when working with people.
Well, just generally on collaboration and sharing ideas and ensuring that they're common standards and that sort of thing, it's going to take some sort of a structure to ensure that that happens? Or is the idea just to raise awareness that you need to do that in every organization at every level that has an international interlocutor needs to engage on these issues?
Well, I think it's early days for how nations coordinate on AI technologies, where there are shared goals, where there are shared systems, potentially shared training, shared engineering practices, shared understandings, as well as where there is a wall and low fidelity communication between nations, how we work together to ensure a safer world. And I think we'll be learning about the details of how organizations need to address communications within their organization as they engage internationally. And so let's see how it goes. We'll be calling out more of these issues and taking a deeper dive as we head into the final report on international cooperation and the relevance of the key considerations we called out in our Q2 report to other nations.
That's it for this week's podcast. I want to thank Eric again for his time. If you want to learn more about the National Security Commission on AI, visit their website at www.nscai.gov. And remember, the singularity may not be near, but AI is about to change your world, so pay attention.